The events of 2020 have underscored how deeply dysfunctional our institutions of democracy are. We need to transform those institutions to create a more just and responsive democracy. And the problem goes deep into the very origins of our system. We've seen in these last few months everything from the shutting down of polling stations to the active forms of voter intimidation and suppression to the more historical forms of gerrymandered districts and legislatures that don't look like our communities. These problems go back to the very core of our constitutional structure. And what we really have now in this moment is a system of minority government that undermines the political power of Black and brown voters in particular. So going forward, we need to transform these institutions, and progressives have the tools to do so. First, we need to pass the For the People Act, H.R. 1, which would dramatically transform our democratic institutions, dealing with issues like voter suppression, money in politics, and gerrymandering. But we also need to look at, second, at more structural changes. The filibuster needs to be abolished. It's a tool that has been used to dismantle and block progressive legislation and the kinds of policies that are needed to deal with our real crises of the economy, crises of racial justice, and crises of the climate. We also need to remake our courts. The judiciary, especially in the last 10 to 15 years, has become an active tool itself of voter suppression, dismantling voting rights, civil rights, and increasingly blocking progressive legislation across the country. And then we need to look at institutions like the Electoral College, the Senate, considering how we bring in new states that need and demand representation, like Washington, D.C. And the final step that progressives need to do is pursue policymaking that actually changes power and expands power for working class folks and for Black and brown folks in particular. That means policies that break up concentrations of corporate power that dominate our economy, policies that expand the ability of labor and working folks to organize, and policies that directly empower frontline communities in making decisions on everything from climate to housing to budgets. If we do those things, progressives can dramatically improve our democracy and try to build us out of this crises of these last few years.
The worst pandemic in 100 years. We're getting through it because of essential workers. So here's a bold idea. When we rebuild, put workers first. A just, sustainable recovery depends on rebalancing the scales. So more power is on the side of working people. We grow our power by standing together when we come together in a labor union. That's why a just recovery depends on organizing rights. We need the PRO Act to make it easier to join a union. And by investing in infrastructure, we can create good paying union jobs while creating access to future opportunities. So infrastructure is what connects us. It is what drives us. It's roads and bridges, yes. It's broadband, public transportation, a sustainable energy system. But there's a type of infrastructure that's often overlooked, and that's the infrastructure of care. Childcare, elder care, care for the sick and disabled. Now make no mistake, care jobs make all other work possible. But caregivers like Brenda Williams, who you heard from earlier today, suffer gender and racial inequities, and many are paid poverty-level wages. Most are women, Black and brown women disproportionately provide care. Now, the pandemic erased 2 out of every 3 jobs in the childcare industry. And without that foundation, by September, women left the workforce at 4 times the rate of men. So the PRO Act creates a path to good wages and protection for all workers, including caregivers. We have the power to make recovery work for all of us by growing our power to organize. So anyone can join a union in any industry, on any job. We hope you do, because by standing together, we are powerful.
We need a bold overhaul of our laws and our economy. We're faced with a choice. Continue down the path of deregulation, lower taxes on the wealthy, and a gutting of government services and social welfare programs, or make a profound change towards a more sustainable and moral economy with government interventions to facilitate assets, economic security, civic engagement, human dignity, and social mobility for all its citizens, regardless of their race, their gender, or sexual identity. A new industrial policy that centers workers would promote a fairer economy grounded in our shared prosperity. The bold relief of a paycheck guarantee could stem our current sorrow and put us on a just path towards recovery. The pandemic reveals our collective public health and economic vulnerability, but in plain sight, there's a peculiar racial vulnerability in which Black people are more than twice as likely to die from the virus. And this crisis will only exacerbate that vulnerability. That is, unless government acts and acts decisively. Right now, we should be doing everything to protect our public health and ensure that workers have security, including gig workers and micro businesses. We need to establish the building blocks for a transformative, secure, inclusive, and more equitable economy so that we will be less vulnerable to the next pandemic or climate-related catastrophes, as well as our everyday vulnerabilities in which many people live. Here's how a paycheck guarantee could work. Government would directly cover up to $90,000 in pay for workers until the end of this economic crisis. Workers can quickly get back to work and on payroll, reconnect to their benefits, including health insurance, and no one would be required to work unless it was safe to do so. By refocusing our economic and industrial priorities on worker well-being, we can implement this paycheck guarantee. We can do it in the next economic package, and we could focus less on reviving companies that are more vested in their profits than worker well-being, and we could ensure that workers emerge from this crisis whole, more secure, we have a more equitable economy, and an economy that lifts up all boats from the bottom. Thank you.
My people have a word in our language, chochwinoch. It means, we survived the night. Chochwinoch. We survived the night. As we convene to chart the course of our movement, our perspective, our policies, our power, and the imperative of our victory as progressives has never been more important. More than 230,000 Americans have died of the coronavirus. The economy has shed 10.7 million jobs since the beginning of the pandemic. Women and people of color have been hit especially hard. Due to legacies of racism, Black people are dying of the coronavirus at 2.2 times the rate of whites. Women's labor force participation rates have fallen to levels not seen in more than a generation. As progressives, we know what needs to be done. Our movement has produced policy visions designed for just this moment, ideas like the Thrive Agenda and the Green New Deal. These platforms have been co-sponsored by more than 100 members of Congress and have deeply shaped the climate plans adopted by President-elect Joe Biden. We know we're going to have to fight for those ideas, against the climate deniers in the GOP, against the hedge funds and CEOs who want to abandon the workers and communities who built this country, against the deficit hawks squawking about the balance of payments, against the big corporate polluters looking for another government bailout, against the climate delayers who think we should just wait, and against the carbon fundamentalists who think climate change has nothing to do with social justice. We need climate justice, and we need it now. And with our movement at their backs, we need our leaders in the Progressive Caucus to go out there and fight for it.
The urgency of this moment calls us to not just correct the Trump administration's failures, we must reimagine a future where each of us can live and thrive safely and in healthy communities. We recognize that every step we take is in the shadow of a deadly pandemic, a crisis of racialized police violence, and a Supreme Court that now puts voting rights, immigrant rights, and abortion rights at risk. We must reimagine a post-pandemic world where each of us earns a living wage, participates equally in the political democracy, and has access to the care we need, including abortion. We must reimagine and work toward a future in which Black people are supported and trusted, not criminalized and murdered. We call on the next administration to lift bans that deny abortion coverage, including the Hyde Amendment, ensure equal representation of workers, both union and non-union, and an on any economic recovery council, and raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour. The Hyde Amendment pushes abortion care out of reach for people struggling financially who are more likely to be women of color. Hyde prohibits Medicaid from covering abortion care, and its consequences are devastating. When lawmakers place restrictions on Medicaid coverage of abortion, it forces 1 in 4 poor women seeking abortion to carry her pregnancy to term. Going back is not an option. We are reimagining what it looks like to go forward together. It's time to end policies that perpetuate racist economic and healthcare inequities and ensure everyone is able to live safely, make our own decisions about our healthcare and futures, and thrive in our communities with dignity.
If progressives want to win, we're going to have to organize in rural America. If we want a Green New Deal, we want free college, we want Medicare for all, we want to beat white supremacy, we're going to have to bring rural communities into that fight. First, rural communities are hurting, just like much of the country. Rural communities have some of the most polluted water in the country, incredible health disparities, have factory farms coming in, and a big rise in addiction and opioid overdoses. So people are hurting. Second, there's 60 million people that live in rural America, and that's by a pretty strict definition. The census describes rural America as places with 2,500 people or less. And even with that definition, 60 million folks that we got to figure out how we're engaging. And then finally, rural America is a lot more diverse than folks think. Most people think rural communities in rural America is white America. Couldn't be further from the truth. The Latinx population is the fastest growing part of rural America. Black Americans make up much of the rural South, and over half of the nation's Native Americans live in rural communities. And we need to bring folks, white, Black, Native, Asian, and Latinx into the fight from rural communities. But how we do it matters. There are a few key things. First, we got to go out and start where people are at. Knock on doors, go to community meetings and listen to people and find out where their pain is coming from and what issues they care about. Second, we've got to be unflinching in naming the true villain in people's lives. Runaway corporate power and a government that's been captured by big corporations. And third, our organizing has to be multiracial and race conscious. The centrists say that the reason that we're losing is because we're talking about race. The reason we're losing in a lot of these places is because we're not talking about race. We're not being race forward. So our organizing has to be multiracial and move people along a path of meaning making around how racism creates different outcomes for different people based on race, and how racism is used over and over to divide us from coming together in the first place. So if we really want to win, we're going to have to make sure we fold in and commit to rural organizing for the long haul. Thank you.